It's possible to create visual novels without using variables. But in some cases, variables can be used to create more interactive games, investigation games, turn-based RPGs, seduction games. Variables can also simplify the complexity of a story tree. How to create variables? In the character section, you'll find a table of variables. I create a variable by pressing the plus button. I give it a name and a value. You can create as many variables as you like. I advise you to use explicit names to make game development easier. For this tutorial, I'll use the variable path. I save and go to the story section. Here's a very classic scenario. We have a scene that leads to two possible paths. I'll test the scenario. We're in scene 1. We choose to take path 1 and continue on to another scene on path 1. If we choose path 2, we continue on path 2. The example shows the case of a visual novel with a simple story tree. Now I'll show you another example. This is a case where the player makes a choice, but the choice doesn't immediately impact the scenario. The player continues along the same path, but after a while, the player's decision will impact the scenario. We need to be able to store the player's decision in a variable in order to decide which path to take. On the toolbar, if you unlock expert mode, you'll find new components. Note that these components only appear if your project contains variables. Let's take the purple component. This component lets you write to variables. From now on, if the player passes through path 1, he'll pass through this component. How do I write to a variable with this component? I select this component. An action array is displayed. I add an action by pressing the Add button. Select the character where the variable to be modified is located. I select the value I want to write to the variable. It can be a number, a random number, or the value of another variable. Remember to choose the right name for the variable you wish to change. It's also possible to use other operators, such as addition, subtraction, and multiplication with other variables. We know how to write to a variable, but how do we read a variable to decide which path the player will take? To do this, I'm going to use the green component. I connect it to the output of the second scene. I select it and configure it. There's an array indicating which output will be used depending on a condition. I'll add a second output. I take the character, its variable, and choose the comparison symbol. And I can choose the comparison value. If the path variable is equal to 1, the player will be directed to output 1, otherwise to output 2. Let's test the story. We'll start with scene 1. We can display the variables in real time. I select a character. His variables are displayed. You can modify them manually. If the player chooses path 1, he goes through the variable modifier. The variable changes to 1. We're still on path 1. And if you click, you move forward, but remain on path 1. I'll run the test again. But this time, I'm going with choice 2. We're still on path 1. But if I move forward, we're on path 2. That's how variables work. But there's another very useful use case. It is possible to create scenarios with loops. I disconnect scene 2 and connect it to the beginning of the scenario. As long as the variable remains at 0, the player will restart from the beginning. Let's test. I make choice 2. I start at scene 2 and am sent back to scene 1. And as soon as I select choice number 1, the story ends. This kind of loop can be used for turn-based combat games or for story loops. For example, a random number can be used to simulate the chances of action success. In short, variables offer a multitude of possible gameplays. For this tutorial, the key thing to remember is that there are two blocks. One block for writing variables and one block for reading variables and directing the player. The next tutorial will look at how to package a visual novel for distribution. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.